after that amazing letter from Lisa, I'm very excited to welcome up Chris Neff to the stage. So, as Lisa mentioned, Chris is going to hopefully clarify everything for us. If you've heard Chris talk before, he knows everything about Shark Attack and the policies. You might have seen his TED Talk, and he just completed his PhD, doctoral study, in the politics and reality of shark attacks. So congratulations, Chris, on your PhD, and we're looking forward to your talk.
First of all, thank you, Bob, for coming ahead of me. Thank you, Claudette, for reading the letter from Lisa. She's an impossible act to follow, but I think if there's any takeaway that any of us have tonight, it should be from Lisa's letter, because she speaks from an experience that very few people in the world can ever imagine, and I think her words, I think the words from people like Sharon Burton are really the prescient ones that tend to resonate and really educate us as a people. So here's the story. So I just did a PhD in the politics of shark bites, and when I started it, you know, if you're going to study policy responses to shark bites in Australia, it was crazy. It was, most people thought I was joking, but it's turned into a very fascinating study. There are two rules that I use when I do this work, and I'd ask all of us to sort of go along with this for the purposes of my talk today. The first is that we're having a conversation about people who have been severely injured and who have died. And so these are not data points. It's not particularly enjoyable to talk about them. It's not, I don't even find it particularly fascinating. These are human tragedies, whether it's 50 years ago or whatnot. I mean, I know in my case, my brother died 30 years ago. It might as well be yesterday. So for any of these people, I always assume it's yesterday for them. And so I just would say that the first thing we do when we have conversations about people who've been bitten by sharks and who've died or have had severe injuries is we just have all due respect and honor for them. The second is to be fierce critics and fierce skeptics, because what happens around these incidents should be fully analyzed and fully reviewed. The fact that these are emotional issues means, I think, that we need to look at them even more closely. And so I think it's with those 2 points in mind of total honor and respect for the dead and a diligence and a requirement to be skeptical of the way these incidents are handled, whether it's in the media or in the public domain around policies, I think that's critically important. So I'd ask us to all do this together. So what I'm going to do, this is a little bit different. The last talk I gave here was entitled Why Australian Beach Nets Are Worse Than Japanese Whaling Boats. And it got quite a response. I got a few emails about that one. And now, but having said that, 2 years ago, we've actually come quite a long way, and I think that maybe we need to redo that one. But the point is, I'm going to look at two things. We usually have a conversation, can you hear me? Yeah. We usually have a conversation about, you can't hear it? All right. We usually have a conversation about New South Wales, and we go, well, the nets have been in there since 1937, right? It's the grandpa of shark culling in Australia. But we don't ask a whole lot of more questions other than, okay, well, it was 1937. And more recently, the Queensland example has been used because they use both nets and drum lines, and those are left in year-round. And that seems to be the model that WA is adopting, right? That's the big one. Well, it works in Queensland, so we're going to use it here. And that's the one, and I'm a skeptic. And so let's look at this. Okay, well, then let's do this. Let's all go back in time and do an analysis of 1937 and 1962. If the argument is, well, look, this has been in place for 50 years and it's been working, and same thing from 1937, okay, well, we can do this. We are all smart people here. We can look at what happened then and think for ourselves. So I'd like us to look at three things. If I do that, that's better than that. I'd like us to look at three things. First, the conception of sharks. Is the conception of sharks the same? Second, the conception of the outcomes. And what I mean here is the context and medical limitations that turn serious injuries into fatalities. That when we have a conversation about shark fatalities in 1937, are we having a conversation about the same kinds of things in 2014? Or is the context really apples to apples? And the third is, well, because we talk about these things like they just happened. Well, they put the nets in. And they put them in 1937, they seem to be working. Okay, all right, well, is that really all there was to it? Because there's not all that was to it with WA. And in 50 years, when people are looking back and they're analyzing how the nets, or why they're either still there or how they got out, they'll be looking at events like this, right? And someone will be standing up here and will be doing exactly what we're doing and saying, you know, it really wasn't that simple. They didn't just put in the drum lines in WA. There was these protests, and it became a national conversation. And these activists got involved, okay? And there was this crazy American. And the point is that it's layered. It's not that. So let's look. Let's take a look and see what happened. Okay. So first, conception of sharks. 1937, 1961, right? Those are our target years we got to worry about. All right. Well, there's a transition. Anybody who's heard me talk before will always hear me talk about. Is this working? It's kind of weird. Okay, good. You'll always hear me point and talk about how great Australia was, because when they had the worst case of shark bites they'd ever had in their history, they put out a report in New South Wales and it said, experience indicates that sharks do not patrol our beaches merely for the sake of an occasional human meal. This is great. They are predatory fishes, in many instances lurking in the shadows for the prey, while mostly consists of traveling schools of fish. Yet they are prepared to swallow anything which is bright and glistening. This could be written today. They could get a job for doing it. So this is 1929, Shark Menace Report. Okay. That's going to change. It's going to change because there was a change in the discourse, and there was a large campaign dedicated to what was then called the rogue shark theory. And again, for anybody who's heard my stuff, you've heard me talk about this a million times. A very well-meaning, and again, everyone here is well-meaning. They don't want people to get bitten by sharks. So there's no evil characters, but there is a fable that gets told about the rogue shark that gets a taste for human flesh and keeps coming back to the beach, right? The Jaws shark. It's all the same shark. From 1934 to 2000, when was the last time Colin Barnett opened his mouth? To 2013. It's all been the same shark. I've got a quote I can show you from 2003 when Colin Barnett said that they need to start killing sharks in WA because he believes that the same shark from 2000 had come back to the beach in 2003 and was harassing people. And that's the basis of what he said it in Parliament. I don't have a quote that was said at a bar on the back of a napkin. I've got a Hansard that is used from a parliamentary conversation about how the same shark is harassing caudal slow swimmers in 2003. So the whole conversation, it goes from 2000 to 2003 to 2000 now. So here, there's a change in Victor Koppelson presents the rogue shark theory. Sharks get a taste for human flesh. Okay, so there's been a tragedy in Sydney, and the newspaper report says, the shark, which is supposed to be the monster which killed David Patton, 14, yesterday, was seen today swimming at Manly. It is believed that the shark will remain close to the beach in the hope of making another successful attack in an endeavor to capture it. So it's the belief that the shark will return. So that's 1936 in New South Wales. And so this theory really begins to take hold in New South Wales. Although, it doesn't stop there. The most famous shark bite that had ever happened to date in Queensland happened in 1937 at Kira Beach. This was a terrible incident where two surf lifesavers, Norman Jervon and Jack Brinkley, were in the water, and a small tiger shark came up and it bit Jervon's leg. And it bit off his leg. Jack Brinkley had a reasonably minor arm injury and was going out of the water, but he realized that Norman Jervon was still struggling. So he went back. And in doing so, he lost more blood, increased his chance for infection, and he died several days later. Norman Gervon died as well. So we've got 2 fatalities in 1937 off Kira Beach. Now, and remember, the story is of rogue sharks that swim around looking for people to get a taste for human flesh, to kill more people. Well, the story gets more complicated and more sad. The next day, they're out fishing, and when they found the shark, they found a portion of the remains in the shark. So now the belief is that this is totally true. We do have rogue sharks. They're biting people, and they're swimming around with pieces of the remains left in them. And you sort of remember old stories like the 1935 the shark arm case, right? 1930, everyone knows this. I can't go into it, but it's the most famous unsolved murder in Australian history. Anyway, and that happened in New South Wales. And so it's this idea, though, that remains that sharks have a taste for human flesh, and we're going to prove that by virtue of the fact that we find the remains in the shark, and that it's that one individual shark. So this is a very important point in the conception of sharks. This is the belief of what sharks are. So this continues. Oh, so what do you do? Well, the only safe shark is a dead shark. If you believe the shark is there to kill you and is interested and has a taste for human flesh, then the only safe shark is a dead shark. Oh, and by the way, so I'm just going to walk through what they would have seen in the newspaper in 1937 and 1961 and 1962. So we're all just going to do this together. So if you've got questions or want to challenge any of it, that's totally legit. But I'm just, for research purposes, we're just going to go off. For transplanting ourselves in it, we're just going to walk through the newspapers. So this builds, right? So Chris, okay, I get that you've said this theory. Okay, well, everyone would have known it. So that was 1937. What are you talking about? This was a long campaign. In 1950, Victor Coppelson put out a report that analyzed all of the, and this is Sir Victor Coppelson. He is a preeminent University of Sydney surgeon. He's the head of the Sydney Medical School. He's got a building on campus next to my office. He was partnering with the Surf Lifesaving Association. He's a very big deal. He invents CPR in mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in 1960. He's a very big deal. And in 1950, he puts out a report. And the report says, you can read it for yourselves, Sydney expert on shark attacks, Mr. Now he's Sir, he was knighted by the Queen in 1962. Sydney expert on shark attacks, Mr. Coppelson, claims that evidence compiled over 20 years suggests that one attack is often followed by 2 or 3. This is because of the one vicious shark in the area, he said. In all cases of reported shark attacks, it was only one shark responsible for the attack, and that shark had often returned to the attack again. So that's really, this is 1950. This is the Queensland Times. Another story comes out. What do you do about it? Hunted until destroyed. That's the solution. The shark's got to be hunted until it's destroyed. Okay, so that's our conception of the shark. And this is going to come with us into 1960. Second conception is about the event and the outcome. So there's no other way to do this than just to look at the events themselves. So we'll start in New South Wales. And I want to play for you a video because, again, it's very tricky doing this and not being in the moment of what it was like. So I'd like us to go to 1939, Sydney. In 1939, hold on. Go ahead, audio. Audio.
Shark-proof enclosure at Deabate, New South Wales, is a fine example of the combat waged against the shark menace. Day and night, people visiting this pretty beach are glad to accept its strong protection. The coastline of Australia is justly famed for the natural beauty of its many beaches. And it is to add the feature of safety to them that no efforts are spared in the fight against the ever-dreaded menace of sharks.
I'm going to stop there. I can go on more if people have questions. It's about to go to one of the shark measures. Checking the lines, Charlie Messenger, who's the most famous shark measure in New South Wales history. But you get this sense of being in the 30s and being in the late 30s. And in the sense of what the outcome was, which is that these things are going to be fatal. Well, many of them were, particularly in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s, because of limitations in controlling infection, the distance to the hospital. Remember the Marcia Hathaway case? The last person to die in Sydney Harbour, Marcia Hathaway, was in waist-deep water at Middle Harbour, and she was bitten probably by a bull shark, and they got her to shore, put her in the ambulance, and the ambulance broke down going up the hill, and she bled out and died there. And so there are a lot more complications in looking at shark bite fatalities in the 1950s and 1960s, 1930s than there are today, right? We don't have a helicopter or a thing or a, jump you, any of these things that they had then. They just don't have it. So when people talk about Queensland, they're always going to say this. Well, there were 2 fatalities that led to the putting in of the drum lines and the shark nets in Queensland in 1961. And so nets and drum lines were added in 1962. That's true. This is the story. So what happened was that John Andrews was bitten, and it was a severe and serious bite. He lost his leg on the 18th of December, 1961. He made it to shore. He was talking while he was being brought to the hospital, and he spent a week in the hospital and died of blood loss a week later. The second incident was Margaret Hobbs, who was in 2 feet 6 inches of water with her boyfriend, not too far away from the other spot, about 10 miles, and was bitten and bled severely and hemorrhaged and died 3 days later. So the 2 cases that are used for the putting in of shark nets and drum lines in Queensland are cases that are really quite complicated. There are questions about first responders and medical care and medical treatment. I'm not taking anything away from the seriousness of the incidents and the resulting fatalities. All I'm saying is that when we talk about these events, there are other variables that should be included in any discussion because of some of the medical limitations that were put there. And so what you end up having, though, is because of high rates of infection and because of high rates of fatalities for any of a number of given reasons, the picture of the killer shark, right, where if you die, if you get bitten, you're going to die, leads to the picture of a killer shark. And my point is that the conception of the shark and the conception of the event itself is very different than what it is today. That's the point of it. So when we're having a conversation about taking out the nets, we've got to have a conversation about, well, and when they use the 60s as the basis for reasons not to take the nets out or not to take the drum lines out, it's important to know, okay, well, what was the context? The third point I would make is that there's a conception of the campaign, right, that it just happened, they just went in. Okay, well, in New South Wales, it was really quite complicated. We just saw the Coogee net. Did everyone know that Coogee used to have a net? A steel net? Anybody know what year it went in? It was a pavilion and the net went across. 1929, steel net goes across. That steel net that you just saw stayed in there until 1943. Why did they take it out in 43? World War II, steel nets get crusty, and we need steel because World War II is on, so no more steel net at Coogee. But but it had this famous net that was out there. But it begins 7 years before that. Oh, I wanted to do that. I didn't do that. The first steel net goes into Coogee in 1922. And at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, they go to cut the ribbon, and a stiff wind comes, and the net washes ashore. So, which freaks out everybody in town. So then when this 1929 net is going to happen, it's not seen as, everyone's essentially like, okay, well, you let us know how that goes, and then we'll see. So the Coogee story is a fascinating story. 1922, then 1929, and it comes out in 1943. In the middle of all of this, Bondi is having its issues, and the concept of shark nets at Bondi comes up. Why did the nets go in at Bondi? Sorry, I'm giving it away. Why did the shark nets go in at Bondi in 1937? Shark nets go in Bondi in 1937. When were the shark nets recommended to go in at Bondi? 2 years before, 1935. So for 2 years, they didn't put in the nets. And then why did the nets go in? Well, if they recommended them in 35 and then didn't put them in until 37, we've always heard it. Shark nets went in. 1937, shark nets went in. Yeah, they did. Because it was the state sesquicentennial. It was the 150th anniversary of the state. And what does it say right there? It would be particularly tragic if there was a shark attack while the interest of the world was focused upon us during the 150th anniversary celebration. Period, end quote. It was about the sesquicentennial. That was the driving force. So the nets do not go in because there was an increase in shark attacks that year. There had been an increase in shark attacks 3 years before. But 3 years had gone by, there wasn't an increase, but then the anniversary is coming to town, and there's going to be a lot of media here, so we're gonna do that. And the government allocates 20,000 pounds. That's why the nets are there. So, okay, well, why are the drum lines and baited lines in Queensland? Okay, so that's 1937. Okay, well, in Queensland, they've got a very tricky situation here. Remember that report that Coppelson put out in 1950? That was the start of the campaign. Big need for security precautions. Shark danger greatest after midday. These are killers. All we've got is fatalities on our hands. All we've got is killer sharks. So all we've got is fatalities, and all we've got are killer sharks. Are two conceptions. So what do we need? A big need for safety and precautions. Experts believe that killer sharks patrol up and down the surfing beaches and often come back to the scene of their attack and kill. Support for shark meshing. In the mail, that was the other one. Who was this? That was the Sunday Mail. This is also the Sunday Mail. Support shark meshing. Meshing to eliminate or reduce the shark menace on Queensland surf beaches is commended by lifesavers and fish authorities. There's the link. You can look it up on Trove. Okay, so that's 1950. What happens in 1961? Well, we've already gone through what happens in these two tragic incidents, right? Well, what happens after the tragic incidents? Margaret Hobbs died on the 28th of December. Pardon me, I was incorrect. She died on the 31st of December. 3 days later, on the 4 days later, on January 4th, the Premier calls for action, right here. Queensland, sorry. Shark tragedies sparked off campaign against the beach menace. So, a campaign that starts in 1950, now comes to fruition in Queensland on the 4th of January, 1962, 4 days after the last fatality. So 4 days has gone by, and we do it. So 4 days, Premier calls for action. What else happens? What we're going to quickly see is experimental meshing. First, we need action. Experimental meshing is going to start on the 19th of January. The tenders are going to be put out the 2nd of August for the next season. So what happens is that on the 4th of January, the Premier calls for this, and something interesting happens. The Brisbane newspaper is flying in Mr. Nick Gorshinen of Sydney to Queensland to study the beaches and say if off-beach meshing would be effective. Who is Nick Gorshinen? The New South Wales government pays Mr. Gorshinen £20,000 a year to trawl for sharks off Newcastle, Sydney, and Wollongong. He is the leading shark mesher. He's running the biggest, Gorshinen is running the biggest shark meshing campaign off Sydney beaches. And a Brisbane newspaper is flying him up to see if it'll work here. What do we think his answer is going to be? He's getting paid £20,000 in 1962. He's going to say yes. And in 1957, and I understand I'm cutting and pasting, it's a total hack job, but this is his quote. He says, meshing operations provide the best known method of shark protection. There's not been a single attack on a Sydney beach since meshing was introduced before the war. I would note that, just noting that they took the, I'm sorry, I'll wrap up. They took the nets out for 3 years during World War II, right? 1943 to 1946, there were no nets at any of the beaches. Also no fatalities at any of the beaches when the nets weren't there. So we took the nets out, there were no, put the nets in, there were no fatalities. We took the nets out, there were no fatalities for 3 years. Not like one, it wasn't like a 6-month trial, for 3 years. Okay. And he adds, every shark is a potential killer. We're dealing with killer sharks, everyone. And it's important that we respond to the killer shark threat. Every shark is a potential killer. So we've now, the Premier called for action. He came up. They had a meeting here on the 19th. And you can see there in the second, oh no, sorry, I got these reversed. The police and government will call for tenders. Oh, sorry, actually, I want to go up above that, that's correct. On the 19th of January, the state government decided on this after discussions with its own experts, the CSIRO, and with Mr. Nick Gorshinen, the man who messes sharks off Sydney beaches. Is the picture becoming a little bit more clear about transition and the assumption of nets and drum lines in Queensland? That this is all really quite layered and it's not simple. So we see this, and I'm going to end here, and I've got one other thing I can show if people are interested. But the essential point is that the conception has changed of sharks. Well, unless we're reading Colin Burnett's statements in the Hansard. The current scientific conception of sharks has changed, that rogue sharks do not exist. So that's one reason to take the nets out and the drum lines out, because they're now there for a different reason. 2, the conception of what a shark bite is has changed. That these are not automatically fatal. I believe it's 85 to 90% of people survive. In many places that's higher. We've had a particularly terrible time in WA, there's no getting around that. The topography of the land, how far people are out in the water, the distance from hospitals, number of variables contribute to higher fatalities than the size of the sharks. But the simple fact is that shark bites are, around the world, are largely survivable events. So those are 2 pretty big variables. The conception of the shark and the conception of the event itself are 2 pretty big variables that have changed dramatically since 1937 and 1962. And so when anybody says to you, well, they've had it in since 1937 and they've had them in since 1962, I want you to be armed or challenge me back on what was going on at the time. And because it's very similar to the conversation that's going on now, where there's a give and take, there's a back and forth, people are making decisions and whatnot, and it's really quite critical to really consider the politics of shark attacks. Thank you very much.